Hi, Shelley.
Hey, Emily. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Doing okay. I'm going to see if I can fix my camera.
Oh, that's okay. I can at least see most of you.
See my mouth.
Yeah. And just so you know, Emily Durst is working on taking us live so that we're ready to go right at 2, which is why I've already started screen share.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Hello.
Hey guys, how are you?
Hey, Pam. Hey, Keisha.
Hey.
Just to let you guys know, we actually got set up early and we're already live streaming. We just wanted to have it set up so we didn't have to wait around. So we'll just give folks a couple more minutes to sign on since we still have about 6 minutes till we begin. And then Keisha, I'll turn it over to you when we're ready to get started.
I'll be able to do the screen share whenever I need to. And
yeah, what will happen, I will, once we get to that part where you need to screen share the work plan, I'll take this down and give you screen sharing rights so you can pop that up.
yeah, I'll have that. And I'm also going to reference PowerPoint, the original PowerPoint that was presented to us at the,
okay.
At the
and I do have that linked in this one as well. So if I need to click to that or pull it up, I can do that. Or if you've already got it ready to go, you can share it too.
Yeah, I already know what slides I want, but that'll work too. That'll be a good backup plan either way.
Great.
I did have one other question, but I know we're live. I didn't know if I could ask about the September meeting. Didn't we preliminary talk about a topic?
Yeah, so we have talked about doing an August meeting as well as a September meeting. September, what we discussed at the Thursday meeting in June was that we would try to have the September meeting coincide with our normal meetings, but that since the board didn't meet in August, we would add an August committee meeting.
Yeah. I was talking about, I thought you and I had an offline or with Dr. Lane, a conversation about who might be a presenter. I'm talking about the presenters. Didn't we have somebody potentially lined up for September and we were going to talk about August as a part of this?
I think we tossed around a couple of ideas, but I don't think that we settled on it. But we had talked about potentially bringing an Education Commission of the States in August to provide kind of that national perspective overview.
Right.
And then in September, we talked about potentially having some of the folks from the Accreditation Task Force come and talk about some of their recommendations that they had. And then we have a whole long list that we talked about, but hadn't decided who and where quite yet.
Right. And that's all good. I just wanted to,
Yes.
I'm just recalling all my facts and points. So as I'm getting my thoughts together. So that's all good. That's all I needed.
Yes, All right, folks, as you're signing on, just want to let everyone know that we are live streaming on YouTube. We went ahead and got that set up so that we're ready to go as soon as we have everyone on the line. And it looks like we have Dr. Lane and Mrs. Davis-Vaught and a number of staff, but we do not have Dr. Wilson or Dr. Duran yet.
Good afternoon, Dr. Peckson. Excited for this meeting.
Like we still have a few minutes. Good afternoon. I've minimized my screen, so I have no idea who that was.
That was Dr. Lane.
Yep. Hello again.
That would have been one of my top 2 guesses. Hello. I was looking over the agenda. Sorry, I was refreshing my memory on that.
All right, we've had Dr. Wilson join us, and looks like we're still waiting on Dr. Duran.
Emily, is the agenda built as part of these slides?
Yes, ma'am, it is.
So is it my cue or your cue or?
So I don't see Dr. Duran yet, but it is 2 o'clock. So as the chair, you're welcome to kind of kick things off
Okay.
and go ahead and get us started.
Well, I'll go ahead and say, and I guess kicking off our official second committee meeting, that I'm not all well versed in all the formal lingo that usually goes with the formalities of being a chair. So I'm going to run this just like I've been running every other shipyard meeting I've been on today, yesterday, tomorrow, all last weekend, and so on. First want to thank everybody for just getting back together. I'm excited to have this discussion. What I'd like to do is just kind of lay out what I propose would be our plan for today, our approach for today, and most likely moving forward for the next couple of meetings. I have had some time to prep for this and talking with Emily and Dr. Lane, and also just kind of in reading some other documentation. So what I'd like to do is first, obviously we're going to go through the agenda and approve the minutes and all that, but I'd like to spend the first half of the meeting really kind of recapping back some information from last meeting, revisiting our working plan. There's a couple of loose ends on that I've gotten some additional data that we've been provided. I want to kind of bring some context to that data that I saw and maybe align that to some discussions around the working plan. So I want to spend the first half of the meeting talking about that, but I really want to allow some time on the back half of the meeting for some education, because I really think that's going to be a key component of this committee's work and review, is just really making sure we've got a solid foundation of understanding perspectives and decisions that were made and standards that were put in place, and the whys behind them, the 5 whys behind them. So I want to have that kind of balance to this meeting, and my plan was moving forward probably for the next few months would be very much like that, a very active working part with a balance with a more educational, informational, presentational part. So with that, we can jump right into the approval of the minutes before we actually get into the working plan piece. And so I'm assuming that's something that I facilitate, Emily. So
yes, and if we can, since we are virtual, and I didn't put it on here, but since we are virtual, let's do a just quick roll call of the board members that are here, and then we'll call for a motion to approve both the June 17th and June 18th minutes.
Okay, so we'll start with roll call, starting with Miss Pam Davis-Vaught.
I'm here.
Okay, Dr. Wilson.
Here.
I did not tell if Dr. Duran joined yet.
I don't see him on.
Okay.
But we can, if he does hop on, we can make sure to grab his attendance later.
Okay. Do I have to eye my own attendance?
That's okay. I gotcha.
Okay. All right. And so now for the approval of the minutes from both the June 17th initial meeting of this committee, where we got a briefing on the history of the accreditation, the standards of accreditation, and then our working meeting on June 18th. Both meeting minutes were provided as part of the board's reading material and our prep material for this review. Is there a motion to approve those minutes?
So moved.
Make a motion. Oh, sorry, Jamil.
Pam, Pam take Pam's motion, and it was a second from Jamel.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. So with that, we'll move forward with the next part of the agenda, which was to continue the discussion on the working plan. I would like to screen share at this point, Emily, if I could.
Yep.
One thing, there's in reviewing the working plan and reviewing a lot of the documentation that we were provided, I don't know if the board picked up on it, but Emily in the department put together a good solid summary, like a play-by-play history of kind of how the accreditation standards came to be as they are today. It's a very detailed document, very helpful. And then they also provided 2 summaries of public hearings that were held,
Mhm.
and where the subject matter relative to the standards were addressed, it provided some good feedback there. So in reviewing those documents, and then also going back to the original presentation that we were given by Ms. Loving Ryder back on the 17th, I believe I just said, relative to the history of the whole process. I went back to that document and I was reconciling that against our working plan. And so I'm going
Dr.
to
Peckson,
share
you're
that.
welcome to screen share.
Yeah, I was
anytime.
going to do that right now. I'm assuming you can see the working plan. Thumbs up. Yep. So I don't know if that helps to make it more visible, but 4 things that I thought was important for us to focus on doing, one of which will, kind of help inform this working plan session, but the other 3 really will kind of help our inform not only the information session we're going to get today, but what future ones we think we should definitely prioritize and make sure we hear from to really inform our thoughts. The objective was something that we left incomplete. If you remember the part that's red right here that said validate efficient progress towards original intended outcomes, we left that highlighted, and I had in parentheses review later, because I think we knew that we wanted to be cautiously aware of making sure we very accurately defined what our objectives were. That, we kind of questioned, are we really here to validate something that just really just got started? How much can we actually do that?
Mhm.
And so in revisiting that objective, and then reviewing a lot of the material that we've been given, one thing that I wanted to reference to the team and kind of bring back around, and I'm going to switch my screen share again and just kind of see how talented I am to quickly navigate to this other one. Wow, my team would be so proud of me. If you guys recall, these were the slides that were part of the original slide deck that we were presented as far as the historical landscape of the standards. And 9 and 10, when I reviewed it the second go around, really stood out to me, because 9 and 10 talks about basically the characteristics that when the original board members and the original department members and subject matter experts were kind of plotting their path forward and trying to figure out what changes need to be considered as part of this revision to the standards. This is what their North Star was. These 2 slides stood out to me as these were the boundaries by which they were trying to hold themselves accountable. They said this was going to be the characteristics of the accreditation, that they were, of course, going to consider what other states deemed were relevant. But the importance of multiple indicators was that it was going to encourage advancement to next level performance. It was going to recognize continuous levels of improvement. It's going to indicate strengths and potential points of improvement. And in the matrix-based system, it said it was going to, each of those multiple indicators would be assigned performance measure. Just when I combine that with the next slide we were shared, is that this was the criteria they used at that time to help them define how they were going to select accreditation indicators. So this is kind of what was their foundation of what they were going to anchor themselves in. And they wanted to make sure these accreditation standards were research indicates metric is related to academic performance, that data for metrics are reliable and valid, that measurable is modifiable through school level policies and practices. And I'm not going to read all these to you. What I really want to get it to you is the intent of why I'm sharing these. I feel like if these were the original anchors of thought, that they are standards that they established themselves to identify these accreditations, selecting accreditation indicators. And we're just now kind of out of the gate and assessing a new system that's really being launched. When we go back to really trying to define our outcome or what our scope of work is, I feel like it's just maybe validating, doing a pulse check against some of these original characteristics that the original thought leaders designed. And so I feel like maybe that's what our charter really is about. It's not about looking to change anything, like we've said. It's not about looking to validate anything. It's more about saying, hey, this is what we set out for. Is there anything out there that's indicating to us that we've gone off course already with some of these early criteria? So I'll pause there for a minute because I just wanted to kind of open the discussion first with where I feel like we need to start is a consensus around what our core objective is.
Keisha, would you go back to the previous slide? There, yeah, thank you. So I think I agree that the criteria that you have, or you showed us on the next slide, that really is that's a place to start, because it will allow us to determine, to check the assumption that those indicators really would allow or would represent these characteristics. I do think the matrix-based system, so the assignment of performance level, I'm sorry if you go to the next slide, the assignment of performance level, thinking about that one too, perhaps is in addition to these criteria, maybe something to consider.
Yeah.
I feel like the others kind of are encapsulated. The other two, the top two, the research-based and the multiple measures, are captured in this set of 7, but then the matrix piece may be something to consider as an additional item to look at.
Yes, I'm speaking in the yes and, not the either or, but yeah, I did see them as separate things. I just felt like these 2 slides, just even in title, indicate that their criteria or boundaries by which they've built a plan upon. So yes, I only brought this, again, I'm bringing this up just for bringing the team back to that, making sure as we're starting off, as far as answering the question, what problem are we really trying to solve? Not to say that there's a problem, but what really are we, what does finished look like? It's easier to answer when you know what your original intention was. And so that's kind of where I said, if I considered what's on those slides, what we're really doing is we're conducting some sort of initial kind of pulse check of that criteria that was used when selecting the accreditation indicators. So I wanted to just continue the dialogue around this, better framing out the objective if we feel like we're closer to right than what we were the first time we talked about it.
Guess on the objective, the sentence prior to the one you just read, conduct data available since implementation as well as current state affairs. Might those be merged a little bit then if what we're doing is, it's almost repetitive to say, to me, the conduct initial pulse check, because in that initial pulse check, wouldn't we be looking at data, wouldn't we be looking at the current state affairs?
Yes.
So I think I love what you put in red and what you were just referring to in the last 2 slides. I'm just suggesting making the objective more combine elements of it.
Right. So if I'm hearing you correctly, that this sentence almost becomes irrelevant because the statement stands on itself that that's part of that.
Right.
That would be considered as part of that process.
Right.
Right. Yeah. So I don't want to. We don't have to belabor it. I just for me, and I don't know how many people on the team have had a chance to read the other information. But for me, I know that really kind of getting a better understanding of the historical aspect of it and kind of how things came to be made me kind of get a better feel for kind of where it is in the deployment process. And there's only but so much really that at this point we would want to disrupt as much as assess and really inform ourselves if there's something that's on the trail of perpetuating a negative outcome that we didn't originally intend. So
So Dr. Peckson, that last comment resonates with me, because as we are doing this pulse check against the indicators, and in the meeting last time, we talked about hearing from division and building leaders about, kind of what the operationalization has looked like. If we are learning things, and I think in this whole process, setting out markers for what we want to continue to have updates on or have information provided to us on, so that we are not at whatever point finding ourselves having to start from the beginning, but rather we've started collecting data that we can use as a touch point for moving forward and making adjustments as necessary.
So I think your comment's gonna be highly relative to why I think spending a balanced portion of our time getting information, and when I say getting information education, I mean really making sure we know we're asking the right questions to capture the right data. Not only for this engagement, but for future analysis of this, of this process. But agreed, completely agreed.
May I ask a question?
Sure.
And this may be for Dr. Lane or any other members of staff who are on the call. I would imagine that the department, when you look at those criteria, that the department has already started collecting data or has this idea anyway. And so if the department is collecting information, is that not, and it may be that in subsequent presentations, we will have some of that fed back to us that we know at this point, but it would be good for me to hear or to be reminded, what is the department doing, I guess, at this point to collect information around those criteria already? And if that comes at a different time in the agenda, Dr. Peckson, let me know. Sorry, Dr. Lane, I'll cut you off.
No. Certainly we have the ability to, sorry, Dr. Peckson, you want me to answer that?
No, you're good.
Okay. Certainly we have the ability to produce all these data. I think that today's meeting is really to level set what you're looking for, and then the department will be more than prepared to make presentations on all of this.
So to that point, one thing that I think is kind of obvious is that there's a lot of information that informed not only how the standards of accreditation looks today, but there's a lot of data that is being newly captured or will need to be captured in order to assess its effectiveness. And so to be aware of, what's the most relevant data for us to understand based on what our objective is, I think is very important. And so knowing now that we're trying to really just kind of do a pulse check against certain criteria, I think that is one thing that helps kind of indicate to us, well, what other information might we want to learn from that the department could help provide. I also think, and I'm going to move on to the other three sections of the working plan that I think will lend itself to the rest of the back half of our meeting. I also think that as we've had some discussions in our early meetings, I took a stab at kind of dumping some of the statements that were made or questions that were asked into either some facts or assumptions or considerations, just kind of based on how they were presented. And then also as a result of that, we also started to identify some additional key tasks, some things that we wanted to consider for the future. And so when I review all of this, there could easily be like 10 different presentations that we could ask for in some of this stuff that's up here. And in the essence of respecting the department's resources and time and attention on the right things, on one side, I want to respect what they propose would be a good place to start, which they're doing a great job at, and we're going to hear some about that. But on the other side of that, I also want this team to have some consensus around what information do we need to know or understand more about that's going to help us better perform the objective of this committee. I'm going to pause there for a second. Does that make sense? because there's a whole lot on here that we want to know more about. And I want to spend some time reviewing these things and starting to really talk through some sort of sense of what's a priority for us to hear about in the next couple of months of meetings and what really is not. Is that fair?
Yep.
I'm hoping Emily's like, phew, you know. Okay, so for example, one comment that had come up in a previous meeting was talking about that there was 2 indicators that did not make the cut score in the original process of developing the standards. You know, maybe as part of some other presentation, Emily or Dr. Lane, you might be able to talk to this. Maybe in part of some other presentation, we could get some indication or implications of that or why. But obviously somebody on the board was very interested in understanding why that was the case. So stuff like that to me is where I feel like we need to talk through how do we either address it, put it on the back burner, or make sure it's going to be in a future presentation.
Sounds good. And I would say certainly we can provide that. Just for being that 3 of the 4 of you weren't here when this happened in 2017, I think it's important for you to note that I was also not here when these determinations were made. And so I'll be learning some of the process with you. I've been here through the full implementation, but the reasons I only heard as a local division superintendent.
Yeah, and I kind of came in the middle of it, so I can certainly help provide some context. And then we certainly have other staff, Shelley Loving Ryder, Jen Pivarena, who can also provide some context to it. Specific to these 2, the student discipline metric as well as the school climate metric, we just didn't have really good data on them yet when we were initially having these discussions, kind of going back to some of the board's parameters about having valid and reliable data that, you know, if they couldn't get that, they didn't want to have it be part of the matrix that school divisions are held accountable for. And so we can certainly prepare a presentation either for the August meeting or the September meeting around this data and what we have now, and whether this could be some additional indicators that the committee and then certainly the board could consider moving forward.
So I do want to be clear in the fact that I really was a court reporter at the time that these comments were being made. I don't even recall who made them. So the fact that they're on this document and the fact that I'm pointing them out, I'm not necessarily espousing that the committee is hard and fast interested in it. So from my committee members, I'm also looking for some sort of nod or something to say, yeah, I need to learn more about that. Or yes, please go embed that. Or no, that was, I understand why people ask that question, but I don't really see that being relative to our focus. So I'm kind of looking for some of that consensus feedback to team, because part of that's part of the effort of kind of scrubbing this work down to say, hey, what do we really want to hear about here in the next few months?
And Dr. Peckson, while folks are thinking about that, I'll just maybe add for consideration, Virginia has a very outcomes-based model in the way that we approach accreditation. And as I've studied accreditation since you decided to take this on, I've learned of a lot of other states, and many other states use an inputs model. Now, some of this I don't like. I mean, there are some states that, you know, how many books are in your library are part of the, you know, the system, and I wouldn't want that either. But what we may think about is, are there minimum expectations of what we would want from the instructional program that would be part of the accreditation system as well? And so I hope that it's not just those 2 indicators, but that we'll look at a broad range of potential indicators we may want to think about.
Okay. No, I think that's appropriate. I think that's highly
There were a number of indicators that folks kind of threw out at the last meeting. Ms. Holton talked about growth rate indicators for 3rd grade, as well as teacher quality and equity indicators. Dr. Mann talked about looking at resources. Dr. Duran talked about an English learner kind of growth indicators. So there were a number, I think, that we, in addition to those two, could also add to the list for sure.
And for me, what I was going to say is, without getting specific, because we all had those specific as individual members, but to me, the bigger question is what's on the top there about what have been the positive outcomes, the unintended consequences, and where are we missing some groups? And so I would love to hear more holistic kind of approach from the department based on data. And then we talked about having outside organizations, professional organizations, right? Principals, teachers, et cetera, who would be able to give us their own perspective as well from the subjective side of the data. So for me, I would really love to see that. I'm not owned, to answer your question, Keith, to those two specific indicators per se. Even the one I mentioned is ELL, that's a personal one for me, but taking the personal side out of this, look overall and what has been, to your point earlier, we're only in this a very short amount of time. What have we seen thus far has been unintended, and what have we seen some positive and or negative effects at this moment? And to your word you used earlier, pulse check. So if I feel a little uncomfortable if we go too deep into some specific areas before we do that. That's just how I feel right now.
So Emily, you just mentioned a number of different topics. You just hit on them. I was kind of highlighting them as you were touching on them, because obviously, you know, you guys have been referencing this document as a tool as an indicator of what a pulse check of us, of kind of what we're interested in learning about. And you mentioned a couple different things that it sounded like the department was already, the team was already kind of working on making sure that you responded to us on. So maybe maybe we could approach this differently, because that's ultimately what I was trying to reconcile, is based on everything that was thrown out between considerations and additional key tasks. How do we give the department a demand signal to say, hey, here are the presentations we're highly interested in, and by the way, here are the presentations the department's already got teed up for us. But it sounds like you've already done some of that preliminary legwork. So maybe sharing with us kind of what your intentions are might help this discussion along.
Sure. And I will say the indicators that I kind of threw out there were just topics that the committee as a whole talked about, that they wanted to learn more about. We have not started diving deep on any specific new indicators or possible data for new indicators yet, because we did want to get more direction from the committee. But one thing that we are going to plan to do, if the committee is amenable to it, is for the August meeting, we were going to bring in Education Commission of the States that can give a more holistic picture of what's happening across the country as it relates to accreditation. Virginia was very much at the forefront, especially when we were developing it. So we didn't have a lot of lessons learned from other states. But now I think ECS can give us a bigger picture about what's happening in other states, what potential indicators folks may be using, have they gone to a matrix approach like Virginia, and can provide a lot more detail and lessons learned that this committee can use in their work moving forward.
I think that would be very beneficial, just to give us a frame of reference for that. And I agree with that. Something that I'm interested in is taking a look at the unintended effects on our most vulnerable populations, and equity across all of the vulnerable populations. That's what I'm concerned about, is how are things working actually in the schools? Is that the intended? Does that make sense?
Yes.
How's it working in the schools? Is that the way it was intended to do? And if not, then what steps can we take to right the ship, keeping all the aspects of the child into consideration? Because when we talk about children who are below grade level, and I'm pointing to third grade at the most, in high poverty schools, we're extending, we're stretching to meet the gap of children who lack resources in the home for literacy and math from the time, basically from the time they were born until they come to us in a preschool setting. So we're spending the majority of our time at school playing catch up with the hopes that we can get them to that third grade test. So that's the lens that I would like to take. I don't know if I'm on the right track or not, but
Yeah, you're actually, for me, you actually kind of make a question come to mind. You know, as far as public hearings are concerned, I understand how they work as part of our formal adoption process. How do they work as part of committee review, or do they?
Sure.
Meaning, again, I'm doing the pulse check concept. To Pam's point, you know, one of the key ways of getting that raw input is asking them. So I was just kind of curious.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we had a couple different avenues during the 2017 revisions that we would get feedback from those folks that are in schools and in the classroom all the time. So while it's somewhat challenging to have a public hearing on every single topic, what we would do is we would bring in a handful, 4, 5, 6, for instance, principals, and have a panel discussion with them. And we would make sure that we had geographic differences, that we would have different folks that, represent, a Title I school, or, just make sure it was a diverse panel in front of the committee so that they could each provide feedback. So that is something we could certainly do on this topic. We could work certainly with all the committee members and with you, Dr. Peckson, on who might be good to come speak to the committee. We could also do that with superintendents, as well as potentially even teachers. And then certainly one other avenue, although, obviously being virtual right now doesn't lend itself to a ton of public comment, but we could ask and solicit written public comment from certain groups every month if we wanted to do that. For instance, at the department, we have a listserv that teachers can receive updates from the department on. We have a listserv for principals as well, and we could potentially write to them, and I think it would be helpful maybe to pose some questions on what we would want feedback on. But that could be another avenue that we explore that we haven't really done before, but given just the limitations of where we are right now, may be able to get us a broader sense of feedback.
We probably get a overwhelming sense of feedback, just because right now people have got a lot to say about the education system anyways. And so it'd be probably surprising what kind of response to that. We'd probably get more responses than we wanted, but as a result, we'd probably get some good stuff. So I think that would be something we certainly would want to consider as far as getting that good empathy data from the audience affected by it the most. So.
I also think it would be worthwhile, and we certainly touched on this at the meeting in June, to have the different associations represented on different panel discussions each month. We could also potentially, as we're getting written public comment, we could work with the associations to have them kind of collect feedback for us. They often survey their membership, and so that may be another avenue for us to explore, just kind of given that we're not going to be able to be in person, at least not right now, to make sure that we're giving folks an opportunity to give us their thoughts.
So given so many avenues that you've laid out of ways for us to get feedback, I mean, it can almost be, too much if it's not well,
absolutely
timed. And so I'm certainly interested in all of that. So my next thought is, how do we kind of figure out a good rhythm by which we get that feedback to inform this committee's work, knowing that we're going to be doing this for a little while, a good balance between raw research, factual data, and good empathy, reality data would be, I think, a nice dynamic for this team to kind of figure out what that rhythm looks like.
Dr. Peckson, can I go take a couple of steps backward? I'm sorry to do this, but I was thinking about Dr. Duran's observation. If you scroll back toward the top of your document here, where he was talking, right there, the if thinking about mission analysis and then facts and those 5 bullets that are underneath there, as I think about his comment, you know, maybe if we narrow our or focus our work, and I'm processing out loud, so forgive me, that if we keep at the forefront the top 3 bullets, these are our questions that we are chasing down, right? That we are constantly looking for. What are the positive outcomes, negative, or the unintended outcomes of this system? And then as we do that, or how we get to positive, negative, and unintended, perhaps as if we focus, and I won't ask you to go back, but on your, when you threw up the 2 slides from last meeting, the characteristics and the criteria, as I'm thinking about it, in the second bullet of the characteristics, it talks about the fact that the notion was that the accreditation would illustrate the importance of multiple indicators in the form of encouraging advancement to the next performance level. So those are questions. Have these indicators encouraged advancement to the next performance level? And how would we know? Like, what is the evidence that we would be looking for? That it recognizes continuous levels of improvement. What would be the evidence that we're looking for? And then the strengths and potential points of improvement. And then moving on to the criteria, it seems to me that the 4th, 5th, and 6th bullets may be places where we could get that kind of anecdotal as well as empirical data. So what we said in the criteria was that the measure is modifiable through school level policies and practices. So as an example, do we want to ask principals and building and division leaders, what policies and practices have you changed in order to realize the academic performance that it is you have sought for accreditation purposes? Maybe that's a way to think about, you know, kind of the process and how we keep focused on the main thing, but then drilling down to how do we get the information about how we assess whether or not it's been positive, negative, or the consequences have been unintended. So that's just one way maybe to think about it.
Yeah, you're making the sausage a whole lot better than I am, because that's ultimately kind of the opportunity I saw, was trying to find kind of like our North Star, the things that we could hold ourselves accountable to measuring against, that kind of that baseline. But then we also have a lot of information that we're seeking and looking for that could drive us in a number of different directions. And so I was trying to find that way of kind of connecting those two. So I like the idea that you said of maybe we're just sticking to the positive, negative, and unintended outcomes as a way to do that.
Yeah, and then
I like that.
If we wanted to think about, you know, kind of a subset of these criteria. So I will personalize it. I trust that Jen Pavarana and others are going to tell us if the data is reliable and valid. I don't really need, I mean, I don't, you know, I'm not an expert there. So I trust that so we can, for me, I don't really need to talk about that. But what I would like to hear more about are the, you know, that bullet on policies and practices, this idea of differentiating among schools based on particular groups. Pam, I think that gets to your concern about particular needs of students, and then consequently, you know, unfairly, the unfair impact perhaps on one type or group of schools or students. And we can, you know, so those
learners, to Dr. Duran's point.
Right. So those 3 bullets, you know, perhaps could help us narrow, because I worry that, as you say, we can go in lots of different directions and really not have an answer. And it may be that for this period of time, this is our focus, knowing that perhaps subsequently we will want to ask either the same question, or we would want to differentiate it a little bit as we get further down the path. So that's just a suggestion.
Well said, Dr. Wilson. Yeah, I think having that this time, I think what the word you just said rings well with me, at this time. Because if we were further into this accreditation model, then I think that would have other questions. But where we are at this moment, those 3 things about unintended, positive, and negative outcomes tied to how you described it said it much better than I did. But yes, exactly what you said is what I wasn't trying to say earlier. I think that, and what Emily was talking about in terms of how we gather the qualitative data, that to me is very valuable at this point. I do trust the quantitative data we can get through reports from VDOE staff, but I really hope that we'll take a moment in this committee to spend time really intentionally seeking out qualitative data from the stakeholders who have been implementing this and seeing what their thoughts are with regards to those 3 high buckets.
Yeah, that's probably going to be one of our largest indicators of whether or not the needle is moving. I apologize again and again, and it won't be the last time for my over-engineered mind, but the whole time Dr. Wilson was talking, I was just envisioning this scorecard, that we're looking at these indicators here, and based on positive, negative, or unintended outcomes, we're kind of measuring ourselves against how well we're doing. And I don't think it needs to be that regimented, but I do see a better way of kind of keep helping us kind of write the course as far as what actually are we trying to accomplish. And I actually kind of hear as part of that discussion what end state looks like. End state means we're able to stand back and look at this at some point in the future and say in a summarizing way how well, good or bad or neutral, we're doing in these areas, and in the neutral or bad, what we're doing about it to change it.
I think this is a very timely committee.
Agreed. Thanks to, I don't know if that's thanks to Dan or thanks to Dan and Dr. Lane, or I don't know who the thanks is due to, but.
Well, we need to be thanking you because you're leading us.
I need to be thanking whoever twisted my arm to do it. No. Okay, so all that being said, I think that was a good discussion because I know for me it kind of helped me kind of understand how we're going to. In the conversations I've had offline with Emily and Dr. Lane, a couple times I think they would quote me as saying, "Well, I really want to make sure I really want to see what the committee is on that. I really want to see what the committee is on that." So one thing I'm hypersensitive to is your time, and again, it gets back to what information we want to hear. So today, the department has already prepared a presentation for us to conduct a review of the current of Virginia's current accreditation system, and then in particular some particular components of it. I think that's relevant, highly relevant, just from a baseline understanding, educational standpoint. Emily already mentioned that I think in August, the opportunity for us to hear from, and I always forget their acronym, help me out.
ECS.
Thank you.
Education Commission of the States.
Right.
And we were, just to kind of interrupt for just a moment, at the August meeting, we were planning to bring in ECS to talk about the national perspective, and then have our staff walk through all of the different components of the SOA for the meeting in August was our plan.
Right. So I kind of saw that, if I understood you correctly, if that's really the bulk of that whole meeting, right? I mean, it sounded like that was enough information to cover 2 hours, unless I'm
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
So that was the plan.
And what I would just, for the newer board members that haven't read potentially the full SOA yet, there really is a lot in there that's not just the accreditation system. And so we wanted you to see the broader spectrum, to see if there were other areas of the SOA that you wanted to address, and we're somewhat hopeful that you will, but we didn't want to really talk a lot about those items until you had seen that comprehensive review.
Right. And then I'm just trying to lay the landscape here of kind of what the initial plan on the table right now is, right? And so after that August informational session, the thought was in September, correct me if I'm wrong, to have a update from the department's COVID task team related to this topic. Was that correct, Emily?
Yeah, so we discussed potentially having the accreditation task force come in and present some of their recommendations. The September timeframe, just based off of this discussion, may be a little premature. We may want to shift gears to think about more bringing in practitioners to talk about the current system before we get to recommendations on how to make changes to the system. That could be a better avenue, but I'd certainly leave that up to the committee to decide who they'd like to hear from next.
I have a question on that. When we think about the COVID group that's been working on these adjustments, how do we message and separate out this work from the committee as a long-term review of accreditation versus response to what's happening now during COVID and maybe perhaps some waivers of things that might need to be put in place this year? But I envision, correct me if I'm wrong, Keisha, help me, that this was not about that. It was more long-term overlooking. And so I just worry how if we mix it too much, I suppose we can. I mean, just as I was hearing you speak, Emily, I was just thinking about how people might misinterpret what we're trying to do. And even when we seek information from stakeholders, as we were talking about a minute ago, how do we clearly message that we're not asking and we're not a committee of the board to make adjustments to COVID necessarily? Because I think that would be the expectations of many if we're not clear.
Absolutely. And I should also clarify that while the accreditation task force and Shelley Loving Ryder and Julie Malik and Dr. Piper they were actually the staff leads to that committee. So I'll let them jump in as well. But the accreditation task force, while it did look at COVID related items, which as you mentioned, should kind of be separate from this committee, they also did have some more long-term recommendations as well, because I think COVID is going to have impacts on the long-term accreditation. So I think it would be good to potentially hear from them on those more long-term recommendations than necessarily COVID specific. But I'll also let Shelley or Jen or Julie jump in if they have anything else to add there.
Emily, I think you covered it well. They definitely had some interest in making some recommendations about long-term changes based on the cumulative COVID impact. Jen, Julie, do you have anything else to add?
No, not from me.
Thank you for that. I guess I'm highly sensitive to living in this COVID world where everything we do is just assumed to always be about COVID. And yes, we have a lot of adjustments we're making to that, but we also have to, I have found on a daily basis having to separate and really intentionally say, no, this is something that has nothing to do with COVID, but we really need to continue to focus on this. And this is something that's not. So maybe I'm overly hyperly sensitive, but as I've dealt with that over the last month, it's been very, very challenging for people to mix things and then want to infuse COVID into this conversation. And there are parts, to your point, Emily, that there may be long-term, but how we message that and clarify, I think, at least for one member of this committee is very important.
Absolutely.
I agree. Could I make also a suggestion or request as we're determining from whom we hear about impact, about the positive, negative, unintended? I know that at the department, there are offices that have been, speaking of kind of ongoing long-term work, offices that have been wrapped around impact on students for a long time. I'm thinking about our Office of Equity, and they certainly would have, I suspect, some information that would be useful to us in terms of what they're hearing, seeing, how they are interacting, or what questions they're answering from folks in the field, as well as offices that deal with or work with our ELS students and our faculty and staff and building leaders who are serving students with that particular thing in mind. So I would want to make sure that we are wrapping around or wrapping into this conversation any intel we have from department staff who day to day are working through all of this.
I think that touches on a couple of bullets that I did want to verify would be part of some future presentation. To me, that touches on the standards of quality and equity work kind of bullets, how are we making sure that those elements, that body of work, and those functional areas that are hyper focused around that body of work, how are we making sure that any feedback related to this accreditation model is being captured? That was one question I had about how do, what are those connection points from a presentation standpoint that do we ask the question differently, saying, what is the department doing to ensure that through the standards of accreditation that this work is pulled in? What's the best approach to making sure we're getting that kind of just intel to make sure that that infrastructure at least is at least forming, if not in place?
So for me, certainly I will leave that to the department to figure out, how we hear what's going on, whether it is, individuals who are leading in those areas, presenting or doing a portion of a presentation or feeding into something. I'm not suggesting one way or the other, maybe just setting that as a request or an expectation that we're going to certainly hear, that what we hear is full-throated in terms of across the enterprise. So that's just what I would suggest.
And we're happy to do that. Yes, we have that data, and we have presentations to highlight some of that work for you ready to go. And at the time the board wants to hear that, we'll be prepared.
Can I share something personal with everyone? We had a school system, and please forgive me for not being able to pull it out. We had a school system with a population of students that were, and there was a phrase that we used for that population of students, that they would come in and then they would leave right before graduation, but they were there for a very short time. And I forget the phrase that we gave them. But when that principal and that superintendent came in and did a presentation, that touched me on several different levels about how the SOA is supporting those schools, those challenged schools with migrant populations, with transitional populations. So if we could make sure that we touch base with those groups, high poverty, L population, transitional communities, things like that, and hear from them how the accreditation process has helped them or has hurt them. I would like to hear their stories. I would like to hear their qualitative data. I'd like to just have those discussions, maybe like Emily, you were talking about with those organizations. To me, that's what I want to hear.
And I think, Pam, you're referencing Justice High School in Fairfax.
Yes.
We'll make sure to include them as an opportunity, because I know they had a lot of strong thoughts in Fairfax around how we might think different about, I think the acronym you were looking for was SLIFE students.
Yes, sir. That was it. Exactly. Thank you.
Right. So there's
And that was what I had mentioned last time. So thank you for bringing that up again. Sorry, Keisha, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
You're fine. You're fine. I'm just going to continue to move the conversation along. There's a couple of other just data points I want to connect to make sure that from a future presentation standpoint, that either it's covered or that see if there's consensus from the team that we still need that's part of our action to address. One piece is this bullet on complexity of the system. That came up a couple times in our presentation and previous dialogue. And, I don't know, you always set out to go after a project that to address things that you have control over, and so, I don't know where that falls on the side of the fence as far as complexity of the system, but I'm just curious to hear from this group when we look at what our objectives are, looking at positive, negative, unintended outcomes based on criteria. Do we feel that addressing that has a place in this work? And if we still need time to figure that out, we leave it on the table. But I'm curious of the team's thoughts.
Do you think we would hear some of that as we focus on positive, negative, unintended, and we're hearing, and in response to those prompts, we're hearing from building and division leaders. Do you think that's going to be ferreted out through their comments, the complexity of the system and ways that, or things that might need to be addressed or changed?
It could flesh out as an unintended outcome or something like that, potentially in the feedback. And so if it shows up again, basically we could say if it shows up again, then yeah, let's address it. We won't necessarily go after it with a spearhead or something like that. So,
well, and I think one of the things we, as we were building, or the board was building the accreditation model, the model itself became perhaps more complex than it might have been because of the federal requirements that are overlaid. And so, and trying to not duplicate efforts, but finding that we have to bifurcate and duplicate, or what feels like duplication because of the federal mandates that are on, that we are responding to. I guess the flip side of that is, is there then a reason to think about then the state requirements? I think, and I'm processing again out loud, part of that answer is, but our General Assembly, or, to some degree, weighs in or has weighed in on what it believes public education should look like. So, kind of what can we control, what can't we control? And sifting those things out. And yeah.
We just thinking about complexity of the system, we could also ask in our request to ECS to talk about how complex potentially Virginia's system is compared to other states, and how, that could be a good foray into that as well to get some feedback.
yeah, I think that's a great idea.
Great idea.
Yeah.
And then kind of also piggybacking off the alignment with federal accountability, you all have asked, anything that we can provide as a report or just kind of background information in advance, we can do that. And so Shelley may want to jump in here. I don't know if we have any comparison information already prepared, how Virginia's system aligns with the federal system, or if that's some background we could provide in advance of the next meeting to the committee to give you all some more information.
Emily, we do have a chart that shows the indicators we use for state accreditation and how they compare to what we use for our ESSA plan. So is that what you're asking in terms of how what we have for accreditation compares to what we use for our ESSA requirements?
I think that could be helpful, and I'll defer to other committee members if you have specifics of what you're looking for. But I think seeing how our Virginia system aligns with ESSA, if we can do that more as background information than a full presentation, we could easily prepare that for you.
That would be beneficial, I know, for me. If you would provide that as background, like read ahead material, that'd be good.
And I think I mentioned the last time we talked that initially we did submit our state accreditation system as our ESSA plan, and that was rejected. So you will see some differences in what we ultimately used as our ESSA plan because of the federal requirements. But we'll be happy to get that to you.
Thank you. So I just had a couple more, again, points to clarify. A lot of this stuff kind of repeats itself, but just a couple loose ends that I still see. I don't see it on here anywhere, but the matrix itself, the matrix-based approach, I know that in our original presentation, we kind of touched on it on the surface, but we talked about maybe getting a deeper dive into understanding that. Do you see that as part of some future packaged presentation, and or does the committee see value in understanding that better? if the committee feels pretty solid on that and doesn't see it as as something that we need more clarity on, then I'm fine. I'm just making sure that that's the case.
Dr. Peckson, maybe I'll just provide a little bit of background that may be helpful. So when we were looking at the models initially, really our choices were a matrix model where we had a number of different indicators, and that we would provide information on each indicator separately. The other option was an index model where we would have indicators, but we would weight those and come up with an overall rating. The thought at the time was that because we were trying to create a multi-indicator model, that the matrix model better fit that desire. Initially, the plan was to just report on each indicator and not have an overall accreditation rating. Ultimately, we did end up having an overall accreditation rating, but the thought was that the matrix model better valued the board's desire to have multiple indicators as part of accreditation.
Could I ask Shelley a question?
Absolutely.
So Shelley, I heard you say that the original thought was not to have an overall rating, but rather rate each indicator separately. Can you remind us why in the end, not necessarily matrix versus indicate, not necessarily that structure, but why did we decide that we had to have an overall rating? Can you remind us of that?
Certainly, there are a number of references in the code that talk about accredited schools. And so we were trying to ensure that we also met the requirements of legislation where there is reference to accreditation, an accredited school, which indicated that we needed to have an overall rating.
Thanks, that helps.
So other than that overview, and thank you for providing that, Shelley, other than that overview, does the committee feel like we need any additional details in that? If not, we'll put a pin in that and not, spend any more time discussing that model.
I don't need any more, I'm good, but I'll defer to others.
Yeah, I agree. Maybe we just put it to the side, and then if as we learn more, it seems to be something that, has potential to bubble, then we bring it back. But I think at this point we push it down.
Right.
I'm satisfied to do that.
Me too.
So the last two data points that I wanted to talk about on this document, and then I'll be ready to kind of turn things over for the presentation is, and then actually I'll be ready to turn it over to the board for any final thoughts or any as far as inputs to future presentations. But throughout this document, obviously there's a lot of references to various indicators, either more clarity around, an indicator or growth measure that's in there, or either a better look at chronic absenteeism in light of what might occur, or there's questions about a criteria that's not in there. Look at college, career, civic readiness index, and ability. Or not in there, but wanting us to kind of revalidate it. My whole point is that teacher quality and third grade measures not there. To me, is there a way to bucket kind of those discussions into some associated presentation? How would you recommend, maybe Emily and Dr. Lane, that we kind of address some of those random questions around all these potential measures and or validating them?
I mean, I think, sorry, I'm trying to think out loud. I think we could, try to pull data, like we could work with Jen Pivarena to see, what data we have on some of these other measures, to see if they kind of meet that threshold of valid and reliable, and present that information to you if it does meet that threshold, to see if that's something the board wants to consider. And we could also ask those questions of different groups when they come in. Is this something that needs to be added to the system? Is this a metric that's going to improve student outcomes, improve student achievement? Is it going to move policies in your school and school division?
Yeah, obviously these are questions that kind of the board that as a whole kind of threw out there relative to these indicators or measures. So some of it might be validated or reconciled from some of that feedback we get from the from the public feedback, and maybe some of their questions or feedback will harp on certain measures. Why are they not there? Or why are they written this way or measured this way or so? I just was trying to find a way to address a lot of some of the thoughts that were thrown out by the board that seemed to kind of fall in the same category.
Mm-hmm.
And Dr. Peckson, if I may, it might also be helpful just for staff to recap some of the previous discussions the board had around these particular indicators and why they were not included in 2017.
So yeah, that's a good point, because a lot of that was articulated in that historical document that Emily, that you guys provided, and a lot of that was kind of timelined out. Reading it and then really having someone give you some contextual insight into what you're reading would certainly help. So if we took that relative to some of the key topics that are on here, and that might help. I think, at least for me, kind of synthesize the information. That's a good idea.
We can certainly work that into part of the presentation around the overall review of the SOA that we have planned for next month, that we can talk about those items.
Okay. And the last thing, I hate to put Dr. Lane on the spot, but the last one was just a question that came up kind of between me, him, and Dan, from what I can recall. I'm just kind of keeping inventory of my emails around this subject, and there was a question that came up, if I'm not mistaken, Dr. Lane, from Dan, that talked about, as part of this review, could we move schools to a competency-based rather than age-based model? And I'm extremely ignorant to the context of that question, but Dr. Lane, I know that you chimed in on it, so I just didn't know if maybe, I just wanted to bring it to this committee as a thought bubble that was thrown out in the past month.
Yeah, and it's probably a longer topic than just today, but the notion of student mastery being the focus rather than a minimum standard is very intriguing, I think, to almost any educator. But I would want to be really clear on what the board means by competency, if that's what you're looking for. And I think we'd have to have a lot of public conversation about it. And so I think what I would recommend we start with is a presentation, and I think Shelley could put this together, and around what competency-based assessment and curriculum look like, because the standards would have to go hand in hand with that. And then a conversation of, is that what the board really wants to do? And then if so, how how this would look and how it would drive policy. And so Dr. Peckson, what we had planned for the August meeting was to, if you recall, review the kind of the mission, the vision, and the philosophy that the board has around the standards of accreditation. That's really the first few chapters of the SOA. And if this type of focus becomes a part of that philosophy, then I think we were going to develop projects around that to help the board understand how that would look. And so I think that philosophical discussion we plan to have in August will really drive that conversation.
So I do want to, just recap me throwing that out there as, Dan's not here to speak to it, but I'm really kind of championing that thought on Dan's behalf, just because it came up and I want to do due diligence by it. I really, myself, have no position quite yet. It's too early for me from an educational standpoint to really have any kind of position on whether I feel like we need to really bring that into the philosophical discussion or not. But I did want to bring it to the committee's attention that thought was out there. So this would certainly be the time for the committee members to chime in to say whether or not they feel like that's relevant, and but I also want to do due diligence by Dan.
So maybe a way to ask that question that broadens it a little bit is to ask the question, are there other models or school structures that may be useful or may help schools achieve in different ways than they are currently achieved, right? So that broadens the conversation and doesn't necessarily talk about competency-based versus age-based. But for me, understanding, what others who study this see, and as they study the topic, what might they suggest would be useful for us to know about all of these various models. So maybe that's a different way to think about the question that's not so pigeonholed to, an either or, but let's look at the landscape perhaps.
I wonder if the ECS could give us that same, could give us their perspective on that same, from that same lens.
Yeah, I definitely think that they, we could ask them to do that.
Yeah. Okay.
I agree.
So again, I just wanted to do due diligence based on just the initial data that inputs we got. It sounds like to me, at least from a next couple of months standpoint, we've got a reasonable inventory of presentations that we could learn from. We've got some concepts or thoughts around how we will get some feedback, some empathy data, some real-time feedback as far as how what kind of outcomes are occurring. At some point, we can continue wrapping our heads around really how we will answer the questions in those 3 buckets, with that thumbs up, thumbs down, or neutral. But I think we've got a good starting point, at least for today, to build on. So with that, Emily, I would turn the floor over for our presentation on the review of the Virginia accreditation.
Yeah, so I think, and this may have been a miscommunication on my part, we had planned that presentation for the August meeting, and really just wanted to give the committee time this month to set the direction. But then we added in the 2 topic areas around the philosophy and goals and student achievement, to give the board time to discuss what direction they wanted to go in. But it sounds like, I think you guys want more information before you're able to discuss the direction that the committee's interested in going in.
So yeah, I'm sorry, and please by all means recalibrate my understanding, because I did misunderstand that. But the link to the June 17th presentation was for us to kind of go back through that as a team ourselves.
Yeah, just for, my understanding was, and I could also be wrong, that this was really just going to be a time for us to, you guys to ask questions and see if there's anything else that we needed to cover as part of that, and then bring you that full SOA walk kind of through each section at our August meeting.
Okay, and so for the initial discussion on the committee's philosophies and goals, I guess I perceive that to be some sort of initial review or presentation as well, but that wasn't your intent.
And what I thought, maybe to save our time here, since we have 45 minutes, if I can take over the screen, I can point you to a few places in the SOA that maybe the board would take some time and review, if you'll allow me to call it homework. And so you can see a little bit about where we want to go with this. And so I'm going to share my screen, Emily, if I have rights. I think I do.
Yep, you should have rights.
So are you seeing LIS on my screen?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay. So if you go to chapter 131 of the regulations, you'll see that chapter 131 is the regulations establishing the standards for accrediting public schools. And what we're going to do with you next time, as I scroll down, is take you through all 430 sections of the SOA. Now, please note that most of them go by tens, and so it won't literally be 430. And you can see that most of the 300s and was repealed, and so there will be a lot to skip. But you'll see that the SOA covers everything from Section 390, actually accreditation, to waivers, applications for indicators. But then it goes up here into a lot more. The role of the principal, the role of staff, staffing requirements, some on family life education, elective courses, instructional programs. And so this is where the board essentially over time has parked some of that input stuff that is in the older school, if you will, accreditation models. But this is maybe an area that the board will explore. Hey, maybe we want to make meeting this requirement a piece of what determines whether a school is accredited or not, in addition to test scores and graduation rates and outcomes. Now, the homework assignment that I would give, and I'll walk us through it here, is essentially to look at sections 10, 20, and 30. And I think that if we can get really clear, and I'm gonna open these in a minute, if we can get really clear on our purpose, our philosophy, our goals and objectives, and our student achievement expectations, I think it really sets the tone for what you want to have in an accreditation system. And so I think it would be good for you to see, while I hopefully can click through this quickly, maybe if I stop my video, it'll move faster. I thought it'd be good for you to see what the board has regulated before in this area. And so here is purpose. And so, this feels like something that might be a little less potentially open to change over time. But I think every time the board does this SOA, you would want to look at it. And so provide an essential foundation for educational programs, encourage and promote school quality, foster public confidence, assure recognitions of Virginia schools by other institutions of learning, determine effectiveness in the standards of quality, which we're doing obviously, and so on and so forth. And so this might be a place where you take some of the work from your comprehensive plan to talk about some of your equity goals and other things, and embed that in the purpose of the standards of accreditation. It might also be a place where you take the work that you did with the profile of a Virginia graduate and embed that in the purpose of what we try to do. So I'll leave that now, and I'll take you to philosophy, goals, and objectives. And here, the board makes a strong statement around philosophy, that, achieving school quality and continuous improvement are accomplishments dependent upon multiple factors. Goals and objectives to be achieved through these other areas include preparation of all students to result in graduate have explored, and then it goes on. Education should encompass mastery of creative and critical thinking, and the philosophy, goals, and objectives of school should reflect and encompass the means by which standards of learning and standards of accreditation are achieved. The board's objective is to provide an educational foundation that ensures students are ready to be successful in the global economy. And so you'll see some of this language speaks to older versions of the board's philosophy and may need updating to align to your newer and renewed focus on equity and the profile. But the one area I'm going to do quick. I'm going to slow down a little bit in section 30, because the student achievement expectations, I think, are vastly different in the way I hear the board talk from what's in your regulation right now. And this is probably where next month we'll want to get the most clarity from you. So today we're not necessarily looking for you to edit and wordsmith, obviously live in the meeting, but let me take you through some of what you state in student achievement expectations. So a student should learn the relevant grade level core subject before promotion to the next grade level. The division superintendent should certify that the division's promotion retention policy does not exclude students from membership in a grade or participation in a course in which SOLs are to be administered. Each school shall have a process to identify and recommend strategies to address the learning behavior, communication, or development of individual children who are having difficulty in the education setting. So when I read section A, I'll give you a layman's interpretation to it. It has a heavy achievement focus and a lower growth focus. And so maybe the board wants to have a conversation about being a little bit more focused on how students grow than whether they meet benchmarks at certain times. Now, the board may think that achievement is the primary expectation. And so you can see that, this whole section is called student achievement expectations. We may want to think about this being student progress expectations or some other term that you come up with. Then you go on to B. In kindergarten through 8th grade, where the administration of the assessment program is required by the board, each student shall be expected to take the following tests. Take tests following instruction, excuse me. Students who are not accelerated shall take, and then you get really nuanced on exactly the rules of who takes what tests. And then you talk about basic mastery, which is very different from a competency focus. So if that's a philosophical discussion of the board. You talk about a focus on the 4 cores. And, I think the board may want to see a more holistic expectation as part of your profile. And then you talk about retakes, and you talk about recovery, and you talk about summer school, and you talk about applicable tests and when a student is required to take a test. And then you talk about how English learners participate in our assessment system. And so what I'm showing you is, even though we did some really innovative work to set out new indicators, our regulation, when it states the purpose and expectations of our system, are very driven still on the SOL test. And so, again, I'll ask you to read this. I gave you a very quick scan of it, but this is an area where you may want to get really clear as a committee on what you want, because I think that will drive everything else that we do later. And Dr. Peckson, I hope that helps.
No, that certainly helped me a lot. I do have one follow-on clarifying question. I was referring back again to that historical document that you guys provided, the background history. A lot of, a majority of that document just is showing the approved changes that were made, which I'm assuming were approved changes that were made to what you were just referencing. To some of the sections that you were just referencing to us. And if that's the case, section 131, definitions for, if that's the case, I guess I'm just confirming that any major changes to a lot of that language you were reading occurred as a part of this October 2017 revisions.
Yeah.
To the act, right.
I think what I would say, just reading it quickly, I don't know every little change from 2017, but you can see that, like most policy and regulation, it's iterative. There was a lot of it that was there before, and sentences were inserted to support the work that the board was doing. And you can see stuff about retakes and everything else. I think that now that we're doing this a little bit more holistically based on the board president's recommendation, we may want to look at this philosophy a little bit more holistically as well.
Yeah, I'm just trying to confirm and validate. I understand kind of the wording that you were reading, kind of where it originated from. And it originated from the body of work and the people and the individuals who were really preparing a lot of who went through the process that we're now getting an historical perspective on. And so they obviously, put their rubber stamp on those words. But to your point, since things have changed, the board has taken on a much more defined stance towards some specific topics. And so they certainly would not have considered that in their perspectives. But I also, and even in you pointing out some of those specific areas, I'm also, in my mind, initially sensing a disconnect from some of the even indicators that we were looking at as far as the baseline characteristics and it does seem kind of heavily laden with more of the assessment stuff. So anyway.
Yep.
That was helpful. It'll be good to review that in more detail. Any other thoughts or questions from the committee relative to that presentation? Okay, so due to the misunderstanding on my part and understanding how my agenda was going to be laid out, I'm going to reward you guys with 30 minutes back on your calendar. So you're very welcome.
Thank you.
Kind of leadership you can expect to me is I'm always worried about my people first and want to be sensitive to your time. No, I do think it was beneficial just to kind of recap some of the discussion that we had today. I think from an objective standpoint and starting there and referencing some of the original characteristics and criteria that form the standards of accreditations indicators as they are today. I think we all agree that that's a good place for us to kind of start. As far as saying this is where they left off, how far off of that path are they? And I think we kind of came to the consensus that we would measure that barometer based on some kind of loose criteria of positive income outcomes, negative and unintended, and through a series of structured presentations, we feel like on the other side we're going to be really being able to answer those questions of whether or not we're at least as a part of this pulse check on track to seeing more positive outcomes or more of the intended outcomes that was originally planned, seeing as much as that is possible. So we'll spend next month, the majority of next month will really be just an information session. We will or will not get some pre-read information. I think there was a request about getting some information on how our standards align to the ESSA and state and all that. So we'll get some information on that. Dr. Lane gave us a homework assignment to go look over those first 3 sections of that law and that code, just to make sure we've got a good baseline understanding for the review next week. We will also hear from, that's also next in August is when we'll also hear from ECS, if I'm not mistaken, right? As part of the second part of the presentation.
Yep.
So what else am I missing, Emily?
So my list is a written homework report from us on our state alignment with the federal system, a presentation from staff on all of the aspects of the SOA to walk through each portion of it, because it also includes things like graduation requirements, other instructional programs. We'll have a ECS presentation that's going to provide a national perspective, and some of those topics are going to include what are some other indicators in other states that kind of look at the matrix approach. Is that an approach that happens a lot in other states, or are there other approaches to it? Also a perspective on competency-based education, and is that happening in other states as well as just kind of that national perspective on accreditation. And so we'll work with them on that. And I think that's going to take up a big chunk of time in August. And then I think in September, we can start working on bringing in some different kind of Virginia perspectives for you all to think about. And Dr. Lane and I, as well as other staff, can think through how we bring those folks in, what questions do we pose to them, kind of the pros and cons of different consequences, and how we go about that.
Very good.
And Dr. Peckson,
And then while I have you, go ahead, Dr. Lane.
I was just saying, I just dropped in the chat for everyone a link to the entire SOA. And so you may want to bookmark that, because that will be your life in this committee for the next months to year. And so just thought that that's a good reference point for us to always go back to in our work. Sorry, Emily, go ahead.
That's okay. And I'm happy to email those links out as well. And I can even, in your electronic board book, I could even create kind of a homework page if we wanted to do that, where I can put different important links for you all and then upload presentations as they're available for you to take a look at in advance.
Very good. Appreciate that.
And then did we want to go ahead and select the date for the August meeting? I had sent out a survey and I have 2 options that I wanted to kind of poll the group on.
Yeah, I was going to ask you if we had that finalized yet.
Me too.
So we have narrowed it down to 2 options that seem to work with the majority, but just wanted to get feedback. So the first option is Wednesday, August 26th at 1 p.m. And again, we're trying to keep all of these meetings to about 2 hours. Is that a thumbs up from everybody?
I can do that day if the other day is not better.
And
What's
then the
other day?
other option was Thursday, the 27th at 10 a.m.
That day's better for me.
That days works for me too.
Okay. Pam, what about for you?
Are you saying the 27th at 10 a.m.?
Yes, ma'am.
I'm open right now.
And Dr. Wilson?
Yes, I can do that.
All right. So do we want to go with the 27th at 10 a.m.?
Yes.
Yes.
All right. Well, I will send out a hold on to everyone's calendar.
And that's for 2 hours?
Yes.
Thank you.
All right. So if there's not any other final thoughts or questions as far as our path forward, I appreciate everybody's time today and contributions to the dialogue. Looking forward to growing smarter about this whole process together. And I appreciate Emily and the team there at the department and supporting us along the way. So thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks,
Thank
Keisha.
you.
Guys.
Good afternoon.